My research journey to Kazakhstan actually started in Uzbekistan. I went to Uzbekistan to conduct research on language policy in 1976, and mainly worked on Uzbekistan and Uzbek language policy until the collapse of the Soviet Union, when I started to become interested in Kazakhstan. I did not travel to Kazakhstan until almost the end of the Soviet power. I went to Kazakhstan. Again, I had been in Uzbekistan and went to Kazakhstan for a short visit. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, I saw that language policy, which was my main interest in the Central Asia, was much more important in terms of defining identity in Kazakhstan than it was in Uzbekistan. And so my interest gradually shifted from Uzbekistan. In the early days, when I was still working on Uzbekistan, it was so difficult for American scholars to get any sort of insight into a sense of identity in Central Asia. And so I read some Uzbek belles lettres and did analysis of those to try to understand what the authors were saying about who they were and how they envisioned their identity and the identity of their ethnic group. It was a sort of like an investigation into some fine details, because of course authors in the Soviet period couldn't come out and say, I'm very proud of being an Uzbek, and I especially want to emphasize my own ethnic identity rather than Soviet identity. And so these clues were often expressed in fiction. And so I looked at fiction. So that's one of the other areas I looked at. I also have looked at religion. For example, the changing policy toward Islam in the Gorbachev era and subsequent. And in Kazakhstan, I've also looked, for example, at the Kazakh language press and the attitudes expressed there toward various religious missionaries coming into the country. I've also been interested in education in many different ways. For example, the curriculum in the schools, to what extent the curriculum in the schools has changed over Kazakhstan's period of independence, how much of it has been devoted to such subjects as world history, history of Russia, Russian literature, of course, Russian and Kazakh and other languages. So that's another area. Also, with regard to education, subjects that have to do with creation of a civil society, that have to do with raising the next generation, changes in policy of such as the graduation, the INT. Again, my focus has been on language, but what subjects have been in that exam? And although Kazakh language, for example, was eventually introduced, it was given almost no weight for those in Russians who had completed Russian schools to assess their ranking in entrance to higher education. I've also been very interested in the attitude toward the past, how history is being rewritten, both for the schools, but by scholars, how they talk about the Russian conquest, or the way in which Kazakhstan became part of the territory, how the territory that became Kazakhstan was joined to the Russian Empire. Monuments have been very interesting for me, the new monuments, how they are treated and presented. And I've also been very interested in issues, again, this is related to language, but it's not language itself, the renaming of things in Kazakhstan, streets and cities and so forth, as a reflection of identity. So that my interest has been, what really is Kazakhstan? What is the identity of Kazakhstan? And on the one hand, where is Kazakhstan? And where is the homeland of the Kazakhs? Does it really include such areas as now are part of Russia, Chelyabinsk or Chelyabinsk, or Omsk, and so forth? Where is Kazakhstan? Who is it? Who is Kazakhstan? That is, to what extent is Kazakhstan the homeland of the Kazakh people? And to what extent is it the homeland of all of the citizens of the state? What is their language? What religion defines the population of Kazakhstan? Not what religion, but what religions? And how is that expressed? So land, religion, history, and demography, and language. Demography, if you read Kazakh publications, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that Kazakhs now are over 70% of the population, and now that the 70% of the population is Kazakh, this means that we should make it a more Kazakh-centered society. So those are the issues I've been most interested in. Kazakh language is different, and its use, especially in the Soviet era, was very different from that of most of the rest of the countries today that came out of the Soviet Union. Kazakh receded and was displaced by Russian to a much greater extent than, let's say, Uzbek or Turkmen or Tajik. Kyrgyz, to some extent, was in the same situation, but not as severe as Kazakh. So that in Kazakhstan, so Kazakh was not used in higher education much at all. It was used a little bit in higher education in let's say in Uzbekistan, but consequently, and combined with the demographic factors in Kazakhstan, the cities were very heavily Russian, especially in the east and the central and northern part of Kazakhstan. So Kazakh language receded much more. And at the time the Soviet Union collapsed, um, people in Kazakhstan who wanted to promote the Kazakh language looked at places like the Baltic, and if not Uzbekistan, where they saw the languages quickly coming into greater into use in more domains, and wanted it to happen in Kazakhstan as well. That Kazakh would be used in government work and many other domains, including higher education. And in fact, Kazakh, because of its history in the Soviet period, it was not ready. The language corpus, that is the body of the language, had not been developed as much as some of the others, including in Central Asia, taking Uzbek, for example. So you had a language which, number one, lacked terminology to a greater extent than, let's say, Uzbek, a language which people who had graduated higher education were less likely to know. Even among urban Kazakhs, many could speak to their grandma in Kazakh, but they couldn't conduct a meeting or write a report in Kazakh. So this was different from, let's say, Uzbekistan, where Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, even those who attended Russian language schools, generally could carry on a conversation in Uzbek, and it didn't take as much time or effort to be able to write a report in the national language. So Kazakh had a much more difficult road to pass. And as a consequence, there was a lot of impatience in Kazakhstan. That is, people expected that they would be able to revive the Kazakh language very quickly, and were frustrated when it didn't happen. So this is one way in which Kazakh language, I think, was very different from that. Certainly, Kazakh language was very different from Uzbek or Turkmen or Tajik. Kyrgyz is in some ways a similar situation. This is a very interesting question. To what extent are the Turkic languages mutually intelligible? And the answer is complicated. Would start with, it depends. It depends on such things as which language. It depends, above all, on which languages we're talking about. Kazakhs, of course, speaking with Kyrgyz, can speak and have a high level of intelligibility. That's not to say they would understand everything. And it's not to say that a Kazakh who takes a Kyrgyz text is going to be able to read it, because there are different letters and it takes some getting used to. So a second factor is past exposure of the individual. If an individual has been exposed to the other language, then it becomes much easier. Mutual intelligibility, on the other hand, let's say between Kazakh and Turkmen, is much more difficult, because the languages are in different subgroups of Turkic languages. And I should say one other thing, if we're talking about intelligibility, which is that within Kazakh language, especially spoken in Kazakhstan, but not just Kazakhstan. If you go to the Kazakhs of China or Mongolia or elsewhere, the language is pretty uniform. That is, there's not great dialect difference among the dialects. Someone from Shymkent might use different words and maybe certain constructions which are common between the southern dialects or the southern, I won't even call them dialects, the southern forms of Kazakh that are the same as in Uzbek, than someone from, let's say, Western Kazakhstan. So despite that, they don't have any trouble understanding one another. But you take Uzbek, for example, the Uzbek dialects differ much more from one another. And so someone from a speaker of Uzbek, whose dialect is that of let's say, the Fergana Valley, might have some difficulty getting used to Uzbek from Khwarezm, Khiva, the west of Uzbekistan. So Kazakh is relatively uniform. I would say, and this I guess says things, something more about the nature of identity in Central Asia as it developed during the Soviet period. That is, I think my favorite book would be by a Kyrgyz author in Russian. The expression of Kazakh identity and the expression of Kyrgyz identity often it took the form of something in the Russian language. This was much less the case in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or Tajikistan. I'd say my favorite book is Chingiz Aytmatov's novel. I think in English it's called A Day Lasts More Than a Century, и дольше века длится день. And again, that the heart of it is, what is the identity of the individuals, their history and their language, and what is the relation of that to current society, also religion again. Western audiences, if we talk about Western scholars, in the Soviet period and the early post-Soviet period, Western scholars who were working in, let's say, a field like political science, looked at my research as something very strange for two reasons. One, that it had to do with a place called Central Asia, which they knew nothing about, but also because they didn't appreciate the importance of language for political relations and political development. So among scholars, there were those who just didn't think this was really very interesting. On the other hand, among those who were working on Central Asia, and then after the Soviet collapse, those who began to work on Central Asia, the next generation, I think there was interest and curiosity. And for people who knew something about the region, recognized that language was important. As for a broader audience, I would say that again, especially in the U.S., among those who were not specialists, this seemed and continues to seem for many people very exotic. And I think it's important that the study of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, especially Kazakhstan, perhaps, should be integrated into the kind of curriculum, history and politics and anthropology, and much more than it is, and even into the primary and secondary education, because our young people don't know anything about Kazakhstan and the Central Asia, which I think is very sad. Students are uh, often not even able to find a course in the Kazakh language in the US. There are very few universities which teach the Kazakh language. Um, I know, for example, that my department at Indiana University teaches Estonian language and Finnish language. And part of it is thanks to grants from the governments of the home countries, that is from Estonia and from Finland. So Kazakhstan, of course, has to make difficult choices where to spend money. And the United States is not a poor country, but promoting Kazakh language study through support for teachers, and this is not just in the US, but I think in Western Europe and Australia and other places, and not just the English-speaking world, of course, would be an important thing to do. As the more important issue, though, in my opinion, is promoting the Kazakh language inside Kazakhstan. And here I think the effect of the measures that have been taken so to date have been pretty weak. The effect has been pretty weak. And I think the funding has gone in the wrong direction. Of course, I'm talking about money. It's not so much that it's not enough money spent on the Kazakh language, but the heart of it, I think, in Kazakhstan has been that Kazakh language has been taught to the Russian speakers, and here I'm talking about not just Russians and Ukrainians and Uzbeks. I'm talking about many Kazakhs who are primarily Russian speakers. That the way Kazakh language is taught has been a disaster, in my opinion. So that is, I mean, language pedagogy is not rocket science. There, people in Kazakhstan teach foreign languages with great success, and so why shouldn't those same methods or similar methods be used to teach the Kazakh language? So I think that the methods that have been used to teach it in the schools, especially, have been a disaster, based on memorization, and not very effective. The other side of it, of course, has been the lack of need to learn the Kazakh language because people use Russian language so often that many young people in Kazakhstan have felt, although it I think is changing somewhat, that why should they learn Kazakh? They don't need it to live comfortably in Kazakhstan. And here we come to the fact that Kazakh is not required for use in many domains. And so there's less need to know it. And this is related to a third issue, which is that Kazakh has not developed in all ways necessary to make it useful. That is, terminology only now really is becoming standardized. And there are many poor translations into Kazakh. I think the quality issue is key here. That is, I think that The translations that have been made into Kazakh often are inferior. They are faithful rendition of the original language. And so if someone wants to know what is really being said, he or she will look not at the Kazakh version of something, but at the Russian or even the English. So without high quality, no one needs that. No one needs a language. No one needs a language if it's a poor quality. And I would say the same thing about, let's say, television programs, which finally there are, it seems, good quality Kazakh language television programs. But who wants to watch a poor quality translated program from Russian or English or Turkish or whatever, when they can get a much better quality translation in Russian? Again, you asked about the government, but the government is involved in these, and I think that the Kazakhstan government should provide incentives for quality translations. They have begun to do this. It is, I don't mean to say nothing is happening, but this is already 30 years after Kazakhstan's independence. And Kazakhstan, even before independence, in 1989, adopted a language law which made it sound that things were going to change within the next months, if not years, in a radical way. Those promises to change were not realistic, but it should not have taken the Kazakhstan government 30 years or even 20 years, maybe 10 years, to make the Kazakh language more needed, more demanded in certain areas, to give incentives to that, to subsidize the translation in Kazakh earlier, to make Kazakh language instruction more attractive to pupils. Young Kazakhs, Russian-speaking Kazakhs, may be more interested in computers than they are in some batır of Kazakh history. So the instruction in the schools, I think, is very important. It should be more directed to young, or Kazakh language instruction should be devoted to the interests of the people who are learning the language. And in the case of children, but not just children, this grammar-based approach, rather than teaching Kazakh language for use in whatever, that is, in pursuing one's interests or in just basic conversation, has been, I think, a big mistake. And the Kazakh government, of course, is in charge of the overwhelming majority of schools. There is more serious attention being placed on development of terminology and translation. I mean, there have been a very extensive projects to translate world literature into Kazakh. One one aspect, I think, is the direct translation from other languages. In the Soviet period, of course, translations were made into Kazakh very often, probably most often, from Russian, and even, let's say, from Turkish language into Kazakh, and there were not many that were done in the Soviet era. It was done with a Russian podstrochnik, a Russian literal translation. So there are now specialists who know both Kazakh and fill in the blank of whatever language you want. And these people who know the original language, English in most cases, but not all, and certainly not even most importantly. But today you have many young, especially young specialists who can translate directly from English into Kazakh, which was almost unimaginable at the time of independence. So I think that that's a very important sign of change and progress, that this is possible. I really cannot say much about directly about the quality. Sometimes when I read Kazakh translations, it sounds grammatically like Russian. That is, it's really a Russian structure being used. Kazakh translations. So Kazakh translations today still often, well, they may use a very large number of Russian borrowed words when there are Kazakh words, Kazakh equivalents. But more seriously, the syntax may be Russian syntax. So today, again, with more people who are who have a strong basis in the Kazakh language and the second language, which is Russian. I mean, in the Soviet era, there were not that many highly educated people who spoke Kazakh. Kazakh, to a large extent, was the language of the aul, of the village. So today you have people who have a mastery of both Kazakh and Russian, who have a mastery of Kazakh and Russian and English, who have a mastery of Kazakh and Chinese, who can do a direct translation. And I think this is a very promising sign. And certainly the development of the Kazakhstan educational system is one of the things that has made this possible.